So good morning, everybody.
Oh, he's here.
And thank you very much for coming to the conference and to today's session. My name is Karen Murphy. I am the coordinator for the Western Alaska Landscape Conservation Cooperative. You can tell by this map that I did not create this map. If the projection would have been a bit different, you'd see just how large we actually are. Today's talk is a joint effort between the three LCCs that are shown there in the white to talk about some of our foundational steps that we've used to set the stage for our LCCs and how we are actually going from identifying the science needs to dealing with our immediate project opportunities while we're still in this developmental phase to transitioning into the long-term planning and setting that real direction for the LCCs overall. So today we're going to hear from three speakers. They're each the science coordinators for these LCCs. The way that this is going to work is we'll give the presentation and you'll hear from all three speakers. And then after that, we actually have left quite a bit of time for question and answers. We hope that this actually becomes a dialogue and you help generate ideas because these are still in motion. And as people have said before, they're grand experiments. So the more minds that are helping us, the better off. Recently, there was the science coordinators for all the LCCs did a survey amongst all 22 LCCs to find out how the LCCs were dealing with addressing science needs. And what they found is that we're all over the map. We do all sorts of different varieties. We have different techniques to get to similar places in understanding. What we've done today is we've picked three LCCs who have actually been using very similar processes. We're not necessarily representative of the whole network, but we've been learning from each other and starting to try and be very deliberative, very intentional about how we go through these steps. And so I hope that you find it informative and then can help us think forward to the next steps. All of us have very similar structures to our cooperatives. And I'm not going to go through any of the basics about LCCs, except for this slide, just to remind you that all the LCCs are unique partnerships. We're self-directed partnerships. We have reasons to be different, yet we're all after a similar goal of better information, better tools, better opportunities for conservation and resource management on the landscape. We all have similar structures in the sense that we have a steering committee as a governing body. Some might actually have subgroups, executive groups or science committees associated with that, others not. We all have a science coordinator and a coordinator as permanent staff. Some of the LCCs are building on additional staff at this point in time. And we all have varying degrees and varying ways to bring in broader partnerships to help inform the decisions that the steering committee makes. And so this slide is just to try and give you a little bit of context of some of the similarities and some of the differences. For the three LCCs that we're talking about here today, Western Alaska, the Plains and Prairie Potholes, and the Appalachian LCC, this slide gives you some statistics about how we're different. And you can see that we're actually very different. Just to draw your attention to the land ownership, this row right here, see that Western Alaska is 75% publicly managed landscape. So we've got a huge federal role in this landscape. Versus Plains and Prairie Potholes is less than 10%. And it's low, but somewhat higher for the Appalachian LCC. And then if you look at what we believe is our biggest landscape change driver in these different geographic areas, is climate change for Western Alaska, but it's agriculture for the Plains and Prairie Potholes, and it's energy development for the Appalachian. So we have different reasons to make different decisions and to form our partnerships. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the science coordinators, and they will tell you a bit about how we've gone through each of these stages. Remember, we're at different developmental stages. The Appalachian LCC is the youngest of the three of us, and they just had their first steering committee meeting last fall. Bridget Costanzo is our speaker today. She's the science coordinator. She just started in this position in this January, so very new to the science coordinator position, but she's been part of the LCC discussion since it began last year. Bridget has spent a long time working in the Appalachian geography. She used to be the Fish and Wildlife Service state coordinator for the Fish Wildlife Habitat Restoration Program in Virginia. So she comes in with a big partnership background and knows quite a bit about this area. She's going to talk about this first step of identifying science needs. Bridget?
Morning. Going to give everyone a brief summary this morning of how each of the LCCs that are represented here went through the process of identifying their science needs. Oops, wrong clicker. And there were areas of consistencies and then differences in how we approached every stage of our process for identifying science needs. All three of the LCCs included individuals from both management and research backgrounds as professionals in their fields, but each included a different circle of individuals within those two areas of their professional lives. So in the Prairie Pothole LCC, they had a small group of core technical experts that they used, 21 individuals. Both management and research, but a small number, all technical people. The Appalachian LCC also included both management and research, but far greater number of individuals, as many as 150 were at our workshop. And in the Western Alaska LCC, they actually reached out also to stakeholders. They had also about 150 people involved in the process, but the types of individuals also included stakeholder groups. And each of the LCCs did hold a workshop to help them identify their science needs. The Western Alaska and Prairie Pothole LCCs hired a contractor to help facilitate and manage the workshop process. The Appalachian LCC also did hire a contractor, but that contractor served in more of an advisory role, and we used expert scientists from our partnership community to help us both with managing planning for the workshop and also actually the process that we went through during the workshop. So the individuals that we used were two types. We had a workshop planning team that's indicated in red there at the bottom of the slide that was comprised of state, federal, university, established partnerships and NGOs from our community, and they advised us in the planning of the workshop. The workshop planning team actually also did include our facilitators and note takers, and these individuals were all expert scientists in their fields, but also trained facilitators. So we used volunteers from our partnership community that were scientists, but also trained facilitators to help us run our workshop and help us manage the process of identifying science needs at the workshop. Each of the LCCs culminated subsequent to the workshops with some type of report that summarized the science needs that were identified. And the process that was used to do that, again, referring back to what we looked at in the previous slide graphically, was included both management and research individuals, a different number of individuals, and a slightly different types of people in terms of how broad the scope of the individuals that were included in the process. So the Appalachian LCC attempted to use a broad number of technical experts so that we would have buy-in at the end of the process. We felt that was the best approach to build buy-in in the process and use transparency and, I forgot my other word, to just have a transparent process with continual involvement of all of our partners so that when we had the science needs identified at the end, everyone would feel ownership in the process and in the outcomes. Our LCC is depicted here graphically includes 14 national forests, 9 national parks, 6 national wildlife refuges, and the federal agency partners span 2 to 4 regions for each of the federal partners that have offices in this geographic area. So I always wondered when they established the LCCs why they have the LCC coordinator and the science coordinator. It seemed a little confusing to me, but I think the level of coordination that both of those individuals have as part of their core mission of their job responsibilities is very heavy in the coordination aspect of the job. And in addition to all of the conservation partners and the natural resource interests that we also have very strong cultural interest in cultural preservation. And 62% of our, this is at the bottom here, 62% of our LCC is forested. I've read that, the Appalachian LCC forests are the second most diverse in the world, second only to China. We also have a large component of agricultural activity in our LCC, primarily crops and pasture land. In addition to this, we have over 200 species that are federally listed, candidates, or proposed for listing, and of these, approximately 50% are aquatic. The mussel community in our LCC is the most diverse in the entire world. So there's a great emphasis on conservation of our freshwater mussel resources. Overlaying with this incredible biodiversity are some very significant threats, and they do vary by the geography of the LCC. In the northern reaches of the LCC, the energy is the primary concern. We have a tremendous influx of natural gas development, especially in the last 5 years, and there's tremendous concern for fragmentation, forest fragmentation from this development, and also issues surrounding water use related to the hydrofracking that occurs with this development. We also have a long history of coal mining in our LCC boundary area, and mountaintop mining has been something that's been very controversial in the last decade. In the southern reaches of the LCC, water management has been more of a concern, and we have had some significant drought events in the last 10 years that have really caused a change in thinking about water resources and the amount of planning and attention that needs to be applied to that management of that resource. This isn't something in the East that we were as accustomed to having at the very top of our agenda, and we've learned in some ways the hard way that this is something that we really need to pay a lot of attention to now and in the future. And also in the southern reaches, we have some quarry areas where we have tremendous expansion of urban areas. So urban development is also a significant threat in the LCC, and particularly in the southern reaches of the LCC. When we approached our workshop, we had 3 goals, the first of which was to survey the science capacity among the partners. And to do this, we actually had people nominate themselves to attend the workshop. It was a voluntary process. They entered information into a database that was managed by the consulting firm that we had hired, and we had them answer a series of questions that we were able to use to categorize them into these different areas of expertise and background, so that each individual that eventually was approved to attend the workshop represented something very specific, and great effort was put into how we put these individuals together within their work groups so that we had good representation of different areas of expertise from the manager and researchers, aquatic and terrestrial backgrounds, that we had individuals with climate change expertise, that we had individuals that had a strong background in human dimensions and the implications of human dimensions on the natural resource management. And then we also created a group that had expertise in GIS and IT information management. We also had them report in terms of their sectorial representation, and we tried very hard to make sure that we had a good representation in each of these categories. So great effort went into this, and I think that it shows in the products that were outcomes of the workshop. So we currently have a database with all this information in it to help us in future efforts of what the background, who the individuals are, what agencies they work for. We used all of this information to divide the workshop attendees into these 7 groups. So we had, because of the threats, we actually divided people into north and south for the aquatic and terrestrial. And then we also had groups that represented human dimensions, climate change, and then a group that represented that were scientists with natural resource backgrounds, but also represented the IT, GIS, information management. And that group decided that the IT and GIS was such a core function of the LCC that we actually have continued to make that a high priority for our LCC in terms of a focus on the mechanisms that we'll use and the technical aspects of how we will manage the information and data that others have and that we create as part of our science needs projects as we move forward. Finally, the other 2 goals of our workshop were to finalize our portfolio of science needs. When Jean Brennan, when the LCC coordinator had started in FY11, she traveled around the LCC meeting with all the partners and stakeholders, and in every meeting asked them, what are your science needs? And so we had a very, very large amount of data that we entered into a database, and that information was presented in draft form to all the workshop participants. So they used that information to help us make decisions on whether this was a comprehensive document as it was, whether it was organized in a manner that correctly reflected the science needs and made sense to the various partner groups and communities of practice. And we actually made adjustments at the workshop during day 1 of our workshop related to all those issues based on the advice of the experts in attendance. In addition, the secondary goal that we had for the workshop attendees was to help us identify which of the science needs in the portfolio would be the top ranked ones that we would apply funds to immediately. And so on day 2, we actually mixed the groups into 6 groups, mixed expertise in each of the groups. So we completely broke down all of the experts that were with their community of practice on day 1, and we remixed into 6 groups that had, each expertise was represented in every group. And we asked them then to help us reassess with a new group to discuss all these issues with not your usual, your usual suspects, but a different group of folks with more varied expertise. Reassess, was the portfolio comprehensive? Did it accurately reflect the science needs? Was there anything missing in it? Was there anything that should have been deleted from it? And then taking that whole breadth of science needs that are represented in the portfolio, what would be the top ranked science needs? And then on day 3, we had a writing team that met all day and used all of the information from the workshop to synthesize a brief document that was a workshop synthesis report. And we're actually still working on our final version of the portfolio and the final workshop report, which will be posted on the website.
Thank you, Bridget. Next, I'd like to introduce Mike Olson. He's the science coordinator for the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC, and he is going to start talking about the second phase of what all the LCCs that have had funding for projects have had to do, which is to decide how to spend the money that they initially have on meaningful science early in the process. Mike has been the science coordinator for about a year, and he has come into the position after serving for many years as the Missouri River Recovery Coordinator. One little personal note that he gave me that I couldn't resist saying is that he claims that his wife is the true scientist of the family because she's the director of the North Dakota Crime Lab. But I think that he could probably give her a run for her money.
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to walk around a little bit because I want to highlight a couple of things on these slides, but my more or less impossible task for the next 10 minutes is to talk about the evolution of LCCs using the case study of the Plains and Prairie Potholes in year 2. And it's impossible for one reason alone, in that we're not even 2 years old yet. Our first steering committee met in Alaska in July of 2010. So what I'm going to try and talk about a little bit is how we're handling the desire to address immediate needs across this enormous landscape that Karen gave you a little bit of a snapshot about in the introductory slides, primarily agricultural in nature. It's often known as the breadbasket of North America. Up with the folks that I work in, they like to call it the North American Duck Factory, hence the tie. We have to always advertise waterfowl whenever we speak. But there's change happening in all kinds of fronts up there, not only in hard red spring wheat, which is what they're noted for, is now moving toward corn and beans, but even in energy. And this picture here from space just a year or two ago shows some of the huge development in this thing called the Bakken oil play going on in western North Dakota, eastern Montana, and up into the southern provinces of Canada. So while we identify agriculture as a primary stressor of this landscape, and in particular, if you ask anybody on our technical committee or steering committee, they would say the Farm Bill is the #1 stressor. There's even energy issues that are beyond belief. And 5 years ago, none of this was here, and now you can see at least the light footprint of these first 10,000 going to 50,000 oil wells is even bigger than the area around Minneapolis and central Minnesota. Obviously, Rick and I do this together, but we left one name off, and I want to call out Max Post-Vanderberg. Max has been on, particularly during our second year of operation, and he's a landscape ecologist with USGS, helping us make this happen, and we couldn't do it without Max. So a quick snapshot of the LCC. One of the first things we did about a year ago when the technical committee got together was try and develop a fundamental objective. Although it took us a long time and we really didn't get there, this is as close as we could do, that our reason for existence is to increase conservation delivery. They started there, that we're about increasing conservation delivery by reducing scientific uncertainty associated with those landscape level stressors, which are important across our partnership. So we got that on paper. This list of urgent needs was from our preliminary operating plan. That was developed before our steering committee met for the first time. And as you can see, they're very general, very basic: ag, energy, climate change, land and water. And over the first 18 months, one of the #1 metrics that we've been judged by is, did you get the money out the door? Are you spending it on projects that are important to the partnership? And I think, at least in that case, we can check the box. We're currently tracking 27 projects, over 5 rounds of funding, and I think 3 of those rounds were actually completed before our steering committee was even stood up. The steering committee and technical committee has been formed. We're working on a draft charter. All of these things that are providing some structure to the organization. We like to say we're a work in progress. We probably overuse that phrase, but it really is true. So we all have been charged with developing a comparison slide. This is mine. I want to just talk about a couple of things. Bridget talked about all 3 of our LCCs have used some sort of a structured decision analysis workshop to identify our science needs. Ours was last fall. As we've developed RFPs, ours initially, as well as Western Alaska's, the early ones were very broad. We give credit to Gene and Bridget for being much more strategic in how they're doing it right now. But even the RFPs are unique in that we've focused ours on management relevance. I mean, that's the #1 driver in what we've been able to fund to date. Western Alaska is integrating traditional ecological knowledge into their process. Kudos to them, and then also Gene and Bridget down here about looking at risk management and testing promising proof of concepts. They've really moved out in this, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for moving in that direction. Last but not least, one of the things that is important are what are you doing next for the partnership? And just to mention a few things, next week, our big meeting is what we're calling a connections workshop in Bismarck, and what we're doing is we're bringing in representatives, our principal investigators from our 27 projects to meet with our technical team and our steering committee and help us refine and identify and narrow those uncertainties, talk about the progress we've made, look for connections across the projects that we funded in that first year so that we can improve our delivery in year 2 and 3. Western Alaska, I think they've even done a better job here in that they're spending the next couple of years focusing on one topic, and that being coastal storms and the impact of those coastal storms on coastal resources. Tremendous, tremendous focus to what they're working on. And Jean and Bridget are developing this portfolio that they're using in all phases of their planning activities. So terrific work on that front as well. So where are we at in all this? Going back to our workshop for just a second, we did a very structured process to try and identify the decision makers, what are the decisions they make, and we've developed a couple of conceptual models related to issues. And this one, I believe, is related to land acquisition. We did this during our workshop. I know Karen Jenny is out here somewhere. Kudos to Karen and Tim for helping us through some of these things. But in this case, the outcomes that we're after over here is on the right side in these red boxes. The uncertainties are in the blue ovals, and under some of these, there's even more layers to this. And the decisions in question are in the green rectangles. And helping, sitting down with our technical folks and working through the development of these conceptual models has really helped us move out in this LCC, I would say, in year 2. And we're going to continue to do this next week at our workshop and work on these things and try and narrow down some of this for year 2. So a little bit more about our workshop. One of the things that we're very proud of is that we have regular communication with the other LCCs in Region 3. We try to talk at least once a week, and we were able to borrow this workshop idea from the good work that Craig and Brad are doing on the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes. They had a workshop similar to this about a month or 2 ago. I think we've improved it. Their workshop focused on the principal investigators alone. As I said, we've brought in our technical and steering committee members to help us with that dialogue and help us move the proposals forward in that respect. Our landscape has been subdivided, and our teams are more of geographic in focus. We've got a prairie pothole focus, we've got a sage steppe focus, large rivers and large tributaries focus, and then we've got a fourth catch-all, which is human dimensions. And echoing something that Bruce mentioned this morning, the human dimension piece of the LCC niche really cannot be given enough, I think, importance. The fact that we are able to work on questions of economics and social science is going to help us not only connect with the public, but define how we can serve those needs through addressing some of those questions. And we've moved out on that. It's our fourth area of focus. Last but not least, a couple of lessons learned. We're continually trying to reevaluate ourselves. This is an adaptive approach to conservation. This photo in the background on this was taken from our field trip. When we had our workshop, our science needs workshop, we interrupted it in the middle of it and took a day where we piled everybody on a bus. We took them around for as much time as we could to see these ecosystems that we're trying to help through addressing these science needs. We broke bread together at lunch, we laughed, and integrated fun and creativity into the process. And I think that is extremely important as you stand up a group like this. Bruce talked about one of the key pieces of that special sauce. I'm going to add another one, not only the ketchup, but the Thousand Island dressing, which is relationships. If this is going to succeed, it's going to succeed because we've developed strong relationships around that conservation table. And I think that one of the things we've tried to do in the second year of existence is work on those relationships as much as we can. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joel, who's going to talk about the Western Alaska example. And there you go.
Thank you, Mike. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joel Reynolds, who's the science coordinator for the Western Alaska LCC and my partner in trying to figure out how to be service staff to this diverse LCC. Joel has been working on this for the last year and a half. He has a diverse and very quantitative background. He came into this position after serving as the National Wildlife Refuge System regional biometrician for Alaska. Prior to that, he was the statewide genetics biometrician for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and a faculty at the University of Washington in statistics. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joel, and he'll talk about kind of the grand ideas of where to go next, and we hope that you'll engage in conversation on what you think.
Right, so the Western Alaska LCC here in green basically stretches from Kotzebue above the Arctic Circle down to Kodiak and the tip of the Alaska Peninsula. Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you. That's okay, I'll try and stand by this. All right. The landscapes range everywhere from continuous permafrost and tundra in the north and the Seward Peninsula down through the incredible wetland complexes, which is sort of the other half of the duck factory, of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, very low gradient elevation systems, to the glacier-driven and large lake and river systems of the Bristol Bay area and out into the volcanic mountainous alpine regions of the Alaska Peninsula. In the LCC, we have about 116 federally recognized tribes or villages. So there's a lot of human cultural resources there. The majority of those are predominantly engaged in subsistence lifestyles based on the abundant wildlife. There's no real roads. I mean, you have a couple little roads around Nome and Bethel. I think there's 75 miles of roads around Nome, if that's exact. Access is the major barrier for doing science out here. You have to get there by small plane or boat, or, you know, in March you could dog sled up the Iditarod Trail if you wanted. But subsequently, because of that, then the information base for doing science in Western Alaska is very sparse. The things that most of you in the lower 48 take for granted, like digital elevation models and things, don't exist. Okay, so we have lots of fundamental information needs that are common across the partners. The number one driving concern in this area is climate change. The impacts differ depending on where you are. Certainly if you're in the north and the permafrost areas, the continuous permafrost, issues with melting permafrost and landform changes there. Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta is incredibly low elevation gradient, so issues of sea level rise and storm surge and increase in storm frequency and magnitude in the Bering Sea is an issue there. Loss of glaciers, change in water temperature and hydrology, change in vegetation communities in Southwest, impacts on salmon fishery. You might have heard of some salmon coming out of Alaska. These are all huge issues. So our number one focus is climate change, let alone, and then how that plays up into the villages and the people who live out here who rely on those resources. Okay, so what I was tasked with, in some sense, I have the easiest end of things because I don't have a comparison chart because none of us have done this yet, which is figuring out how to do the strategic planning for sort of the next 5 years or so of our activities. Really, we have to blend three different things, sort of the standard steps that you see up here for strategic planning in terms of defining your vision and stepping those down to goals and the processes for coming up with your priorities. We need to blend that with the fact that really what we want is a science plan. We're supposed to be about applied science for improving conservation and resource management decision making. And so subsequently you need to have put some energy into developing a strong conceptual foundation for the science aspects that allow you to integrate all your activities so that those things hang together and you can see where the gaps are and where to best put your energy. The third component is the bit about that this is supposed to be about decision making. So we need to bring in aspects of decision analysis and really think about what are the information needs of the decision makers for guiding our prioritization process. So as Bridget mentioned, we had a science workshop back in last spring, about 150 people involved. We came up with this really nice list that you can't read because we got, depending on how you count, like over 100 high priority science needs. You can lump these maybe into like 46 high priority science needs if you want to really get, you know, broad brush. Those range anywhere from things, very detailed things like digital elevation models, to very broad things like the common need for better data access, sharing, and data management issues that are common across all the agencies. So the task is really to figure out how to take those and come up with some strategic plan and activities for the next handful of years. So the first step really is trying to develop your shared vision of success. Our steering committee is just now beginning to engage on this formally. We've done some of this informally in terms of defining our mission and conservation goals for the LCC program. I think we're looking mainly at a 5-year horizon, 5 to 10-year horizon. We still have to pin that down. In going through this process to develop your vision of success, there's a couple things you have to keep in mind. We have at least 3 different clientele or customer bases or audiences, depending on how you want to phrase that. One, very important one, being Congress and DOI, since they're funding this. So they've been kind enough to give us these high priority performance goals, so we need to somehow work those into our vision of success so that those get addressed. We also have all of the partners that are actively engaged in our steering committee and in the LCC. They all have different interests and needs and wants, so we need to bring those in to our vision of success. And we also have lots of other stakeholders and the communities and everybody else who's going to be interested, but we want to make sure that we bring them on and that they support the LCC and what we're doing. So you have very different audiences that all of those need to be blended in defining what your vision of success in the next 3, 5, 10 years is going to be. Probably you're not going to be able to satisfy all of them instantaneously in the next 3 to 5 years. So there's going to have to be some sort of prioritization of how you step those different needs and goals down to the ones you're going to focus on. The other thing to think about is that not only you're trying to define what their goals are, but you need to think about institutionally not only what do we want in terms of programs and products in the next 5 years to have developed, but organizational development, like Mike mentioned, and institutional development. We got to develop processes for continually figuring out the needs and priorities. We need to develop processes for having feedback in from evaluating the activities that we've undertaken to figure out, okay, did that work so well, did that not work well? Really turn the LCC itself into a model of adaptive management, as well as developing your relationships with your partners. One of the aspects of this that's going to come up that I think people are all doing implicitly, but we need to be more explicit, is really clearly defining what are the characteristics of the sorts of projects and activities that each LCC is individually going to focus, that rise to the attention and that seem appropriate for that activity. Appalachian did a very nice job. They have this list of 10 criteria that needs or projects have to meet in order to, at least a handful of them, not necessarily all 10 of them, to qualify as being something appropriate for the LCC to put their energy in. There's going to be some of those that are common across all LCCs in terms of spatial scale, in terms of applied science for decision making for the resource managers and the partners, but there's going to be other unique features to each LCC. You know, our Western Alaska, in developing our charter, we have these 5 goals that we have. They really try and address, appropriately so, a whole range of things that go from a real emphasis on communication and sort of education technology transfer to applied science to analysis and synthesis and integration, versus some of this stuff up here could involve the data management as well as sort of classic funding of research projects. You need to think about, are we going to pick for the next 5 years, or do we want to have particular priorities in these goals in terms of developing our vision? Because some of these, addressing them well, are going to require certain staffing decisions that will end up pushing us down certain paths, and you're not going to be able to radically change 3 years into it. So there's a lot of thought that needs to go into that, along with the issue of really balancing your short-term versus your long-term needs. So obviously we want to be doing things that in the short run give us some quick products so that we can get buy-in among the partners, that everybody gets engaged, and so that they can feel enthusiastic about getting involved in this. Thank you. And I need to talk a lot faster. And in the but we want to stage ourselves for much better long-run success. Okay. So the other main topic I want to talk about is then beginning to set some priorities at sort of high-level focus areas. Really, there's two sets of needs that the LCCs need to be engaged in doing, and I think we've done a pretty good job at one, and we're starting to make inroads on the other, but I don't think it's received the attention. At the upper level is really the information needs of the decision makers and managers. That's really the ultimate goal of what we're, in some sense, of what we're trying to achieve here. At the lower level are really the science needs, whether they be topical needs about we don't understand enough on permafrost maps and melting, or whether they tend to be in the realm of science services like data management, data integration. Right? You've got two different sets of needs. I think we've done, all the LCCs are engaged at some level in identifying priority science needs, but we need to make sure they link back to the decision makers so that, okay, thanks. So that the efforts we engage in actually feed back into improving the conservation and resource management. I was going to talk about this nice example that Mike just showed, but I don't have time. So, but this would be the ideal world, would be to develop these influence diagrams and conceptual models and merging the ecosystem models with the decisions to really pin down where the uncertainties are and where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, where you're going to get the most reduction in uncertainty that leads to the better outcomes you want from the science. But I don't have time to tell you that. So other approaches people could use would be really to just fix priorities on your science needs, pick particular landscapes or ecosystems, conceptual models, blah, 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 integration. The other, you could pick priorities on these science services, right? And decide, okay, really the best thing the LCC might be able to do for the partners is to fill some of these gaps in science services. So there's a lot of decisions there. The route you take is going to depend on sort of a lot of different factors. Your partner comfort on your steering committee and the political reality, even though starting with the decisions will have the highest rate of success of getting to the goal we all want, that's fraught with a lot more political issues than starting with something neutral like we don't understand enough about permafrost. Now, whichever way, you can sort of enter this any way you want. In the end, you need to make sure there's clear linkages among all these pieces, however you go there, and whatever the best route to take to bring the partners to the table and keep them engaged until they see the products and that this is actually a worthwhile venture. And at that, I'm going to stop. The intention is really to go and start a dialogue on some of these key questions, and I'm going to let Karen moderate that.
Thank you, Joel. While these questions are up on the screen, and this is where we really want to turn this over into being an interactive dialogue with you, first off, I'd like to have you help me thank the three speakers. They will all be available for answering these questions, or maybe not answering them, how about responding and talking about ideas. In addition to these three, we have Rick Nelson of the Plains and Prairie Potholes. He's the LCC coordinator, and Gene Brennan is the LCC coordinator for the Appalachian LCC. So we can all try and respond. So at this point, what we'd like to do, if you have questions specific to one of the presentations, please identify which one you would like to ask, and we'll do it. Otherwise, these questions are really to try and stimulate discussion. These are things that we're finding kind of challenging and trying to figure out the best approach to do this. And maybe there's another piece that we haven't talked about that we would like for you to identify and help us think about as we start moving forward. So are there any comments or questions? Back here with the blue shirt. And would you identify who you are, and I'll try and repeat the question for the audience.
Fort Melton with the National Parks Conservation Association in Washington, D.C. One issue we struggle with at almost every regional level where we operate, from Appalachia with mountaintop mining and further north in the Mid-Atlantic with fracking development outside of Glacier, Teton, the list goes on and on, to North Dakota with the development around Teddy Roosevelt now. One issue we're seeing is sort of mixed priorities from the administration, maybe less so from the administration, but between the states and the administration. And in a place like Teddy Roosevelt, you have a part that's essentially being hemmed in by development from fracking and oil and gas. At the same time that AGO and other portions of the Fed are sort of pushing priorities about connectivity, climate adaptation, studying these issues. It seems like, to get at that there's a unique opportunity for the LCCs regionally. And I think there could be some variance between how this works with different regions based on regional politics. understand what science is lacking and help make sure that we're mixing those two priorities. We're not just doing resource extraction, we're also thinking about connectivity to Teddy Roosevelt, for instance. So I wonder if that's an issue that you all are discussing as you sort of lay out your process, and just generally kind of throw that out there.
Okay, great. Did everybody hear that, or do I need to try and paraphrase? Okay, great. So who would like to?
Well,
Sorry,
since it
Mike?
started with Teddy Roosevelt, if I could take a shot, but I'm going to lean on Max and Rick too to help this. The diagram that was shown relative to land acquisition is simple compared to the one that we've developed relative to energy development in that area, the uncertainties, the outcomes of interest, and the decisions that are made. But Max, I know you were involved with some of those energy discussions. We've funded a couple of projects, but they're at that species question level, not necessarily what you were getting after. But Rick or Max, any thoughts on this?
If you saw Bruce Stein's presentation, I think the last slide sentence he had up there to us was really significant. Because what we run into, and you mentioned it, is there's this difference between policies and laws. And so one of the aspects that we're really focused on in our LCC is the human dimensions aspect. And to put it in a nutshell, a friend of mine said to me the other day, we'll never save prairie wetlands, we'll never save native prairie based on ducks and songbirds alone. So if we don't start making the science that we're doing relevant to where people live, we're going to lose those battles. Because in North Dakota right now, we're rich. We got more money in North Dakota than the federal government has. Right? We got oil coming out our ears. And so the state, for example, is just giddy, as states are, about having all kinds of extra money. So when we talk to them about Teddy Roosevelt being surrounded and the view shed and all these things, going to hell in a handbasket, that has to be balanced off in the context of there's people that are making $100,000 a year driving trucks. Can't get school bus drivers in North Dakota because they're making more money driving oil trucks than they are driving school bus. So the focus on that management relevance and making that relevant to humans, so we can start to convince them that these issues are where they live. They need to be concerned about them, not just from the science perspective, but from that social economic aspect. So we focus very heavily on that because we often run into these conflicting policies, laws, not just between interior agencies, but between the states and the feds in particular. So that's one of the areas we're really excited about working on.
Thanks, Rick and Mike. Let's go to the next question, and if you want to talk more with them, Max is also here from that Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC. Here.
Jared McMahon from the Southeast Climate Science Center. Our ability to do science work that passes the so what test really depends on you guys doing the issue identification and science planning stuff well, so that you can let us know what is of consequence to do. And I realized that the presentations today were more on the process of issue identification and planning, but I'm really curious, and maybe this is more a philosophical question, but if you guys could reflect a bit on what you all see as important roles that the climate science centers can play, particularly as you go from the issue ID and planning stuff into action, which presumably part is science activities. What are you guys looking for from the science centers?
Start with Joel for this one, because I know we've got...
I was going to say, you could answer this one as well. So we've actually, we're developing a really close relationship with the Alaska Climate Science Center. We've both sort of developed our operational plans for this year and next year, sort of very, very much linked. We had a lot of discussions when we were trying to pin down this pilot program, pilot project idea of possible topics that we would be focusing on, more sort of ecosystem type topics. And then that led at the same time to a series of conversations with the Science Center, which then also you have to, this is probably the only PowerPoint that we don't have, the slide that explains in Alaska you have the Alaska Climate Change Executive Roundtable, ACER up here, and then you've got the C4 down here, and then you've got agencies and feds, and I'm sort of learning all that, but I should know it. Actually, it's tattooed on my back. But we've had not only been able to tee up so that we have complementary projects so that the postdocs are getting hired by the Climate Science Center that are going to feed in and focus on the coastal storms thing. We're also engaging, trying to get promoting a statewide discussion on hydrology that the Climate Science Center is playing a very key role both in terms of its linkage to USGS, but also access to researchers at the university, and also using the Climate Science Center as sort of a lever in these discussions at C4 and ACER to promote broader agencies addressing some of these broad issues.
Thanks, Joel. And Bridget would like to say something about the relationship with the Appalachian side.
This came up yesterday. We had a meeting all day with the science coordinators met and the LCC coordinators met, and then in the afternoon we merged. And one of the things that we discussed in the science coordinator meeting was something that I brought up that Gene had led our steering committee through, which Joel had also referred to in his talk, which was a list that was developed on what was an appropriate project for an LCC. And I think if you're familiar with stages that are recommended when you go through any kind of change management, I think all the agencies got an A+ on the establishing the sense of urgency, and also on getting buy-in from the stakeholders. We're still working on getting buy-in, but we have a lot of buy-in already, especially at the LCC level, so we're doing quite well with that. But it seems to me that we've skipped a little bit too quickly past the establishing a vision. So I think, for our LCC, we with Gene's leadership, we do have a list of projects, or priorities that we can articulate to other people, both people that apply for funding with us, people that are potential partners with us, others that we work with, other LCCs, on what types of projects are actually appropriate and what we're interested in working on, and this helped us tremendously in establishing science needs. It seems to me that the climate science centers need to develop something similar, and that there'll be areas of overlap between what our LCC or the LCC network thinks is appropriate activity and what the climate science centers individually and as a group think are appropriate, but we haven't done a really good job. We're not in the A class yet on articulating what that is. And unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of time to hammer that out yesterday. So,
Thanks, Bridget. Next question. Back in the room there.
My name is Lucy Moore, and I'm under contract with the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution to help them think about how to work with tribes and the LCCs and the Climate Science Center. So my question relates to that. I was really interested, Mike, that I think one of your slides had the BIA as a member of the steering committee. I'm curious how that works as a way of, oops, he's smiling, as a way of getting tribal representation, and also how Western Alaska dealt with it with that huge number of tribes, and I think you had 2 or 3. Anyway, how that's going.
That's a very broad topic and probably will need to be carried on out afterwards, but we'll let Mike start and very
try
quickly
a real
to Joel.
short answer related to how well the BIA works at getting tribes involved poorly. But I will say, again, going back to some work that's being done in another LCC, the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes, they've actually funded a very interesting project about how do we reach out successfully to tribes. What are the partnerships that work with tribes and which ones don't, and what are the pieces of those partnerships that are successful that we can adopt and integrate. We've had less than full success in bringing the tribes along into our LCC. Western Alaska has done a much better job, but we're still working on it. Rick, anything?
Okay. Actually, before we end this question, and I think it would be great to talk more about this because it's a big topic, and all the LCCs are really trying to address that. I'd like Gene very briefly to tell about, there's a conference coming up in a month that the LCCs will be presenting at. Gene, would you?
Sure. In the Appalachian Gene, can you stand, please?
Why don't you come up front, actually, so people can hear. And we only have 5 more minutes, so this will be a quick response, and then maybe one more question, and then we'll let you all get a lunch.
All right. In the Appalachians, we do have representation on our steering committee, and because of that, we were also invited to host a LCC session at their plenary at the National Native American Fish and Wildlife Society meetings. So part of the answer to your question is engaging tribes at what level? At tribal leadership, or in this case, what we're talking about for this May meeting in Cherokee, North Carolina, is working with the fish and wildlife or natural resource part of the larger community as our entry point to that community. And we are similarly canvassing all the LCCs to see their experience, what works, what doesn't, and then how best to communicate to the tribes issues of their interest in engaging with LCCs.
Thank you. Right. Thank you, Jane. One last question. In the middle.
I'm Bruce Goldstein. I'm in the Department of Planning and Design at the University of Colorado Boulder in Denver. And I have a question about coordination, overall coordination and guidance. I looked at habitat conservation planning and the Nature Conservancy and DOI, Forest Services, Fire Network. And there's this tension between the desire to give people creative leeway and the desire to have some sort of coherence within the network to give people an idea of what best practices are in terms of how you organize and plan these ventures. I'm wondering, can you give me a sense of what kind of guidance or what kind of best practices or what kind of expert advice that LCC has provided you in terms of organizing these processes? In other words, are you on your own, or are you getting advice in terms of how best to coordinate among all these various players and stakeholders?
I think the answer is yes.
To all the above.
Unless anybody else wants to, Joel will stand up. He'll take it. Perfect.
Yeah, let me off on the tribal one. So it's an evolving process. Certainly from the meeting, there was a LCC coordinators meeting in Georgia last spring. And coming out of that was a number of work groups were formed. And basically all those work groups, so there's one on science needs assessment, there's one on LCC's Climate Science Center relationships, there's one on monitoring and LCCs. Each of those work groups is going through a process that's basically leading to compiling as quickly as we can, among all of our other duties as assigned, sort of best practices for the LCCs that have made some progress to share with the other LCCs that are coming up, because there's this tiered development across the network, and so everybody's actually trying to interact quite a bit. That's subsequently why, for most of you, this is a 2-day meeting. Most of us, this is a 4-day meeting, because we figured, it's this chance to all get together and share ideas. So we all got together yesterday. The coordinators all met and talked about a number of things. The science coordinators met and talked about a number of things and are actively engaged in trying to exchange that. Ben could probably tell you more, and the guy in blue right in front of you, could probably tell you more in terms of the guidance coming down out of DC, but a lot of it's everybody's talking to each other, just trying to share experience.
And I think in closing, this has largely been organic, what you've seen today. Certainly we've drawn on a lot of resources and a lot of efforts that have been tried in other places and drawn from the experiences of other big initiatives. So we're not entirely on our own, but there is no directive that says you must do your science needs assessment in this fashion. So we're all trying to figure out what the best approach is to meet the unique characteristics of our geographic areas. And we're also trying to share and build off of what we've learned in other places, which is really the example that we've shown you here today. With that, thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the conference. Thank you. And remember, we're meeting back in the grand ballroom after lunch.
Well done, folks. Yeah. Yep.